Russia has intensified its attacks on Ukraine's power grid again, leaving cities in darkness as temperatures drop. At the same time, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says Ukraine wants to borrow Patriot air defense systems from Europe. To discuss this and the broader situation on the front line, I'm joined now by retired Royal Air Force pilot and military analyst Sean Bell. Sean, it's a pleasure to have you here in our studio online.
It's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for having me.
Sean, in Ukraine, we're facing really rough blackouts again, and Russians are striking our power plants with growing precision. Talks about negotiations have gone quiet so far, and meanwhile, President Zelenskyy says Ukraine wants to borrow Patriot air defense systems from Europe. I understand such precedents have existed before between other countries, but for Ukraine, is that technically and politically possible, or it's not something special, and who could potentially provide these systems to Ukraine?
Yeah, good afternoon. There's a lot of questions in there. I think let's look at the Patriot systems to start with. They are a very, very capable air defense system, but they're also very expensive, and they are specially made to focus on cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. And therefore, they proved invaluable in helping defend Ukraine. But a lot of the attacks at the moment on the energy infrastructure are also being done by those Shahed drones. And those drones, the Patriot missile system is not the right system to shoot those down at all. So with Russia looking to try to launch 1,000 of these drones each day at times, trying to overwhelm the Ukrainian air defense system, that is a real challenge for Ukraine. I think the other part is that whilst I was out in Ukraine only a month ago, and I recognise the attacks on the energy infrastructure, particularly at this time of year, are very difficult for Ukrainians, but I suspect that Russia is not just trying to make life miserable for Ukrainians. I suspect they're also trying to target the energy to stop your industrial base, because it's becoming increasingly effective at producing not just short-range drones, but also long-range drones, which have been punishing the Russian energy sector as well.
Okay. Well, I don't know why this conversation still exists. And okay, but if so, if the countries will lend such systems to Ukraine, will they keep some political control over them, right? And what do they actually, gain from that if they will borrow these systems to us?
Well, yes, I think the conversation about weapons, if I was to be honest, is more about offensive weapons rather than the defensive weapons. I understand fully why Ukrainian people want to be protected, but ultimately this is about winning the war, not about protecting Kyiv or its civilian population. And at the moment, on the front line of the battle, as you well know, Russia is moving forward slowly. Ukraine is doing an amazing job of fighting and slowing Russia down, but Russia is moving slowly forward. The one area where Ukraine has hurt President Putin is attacking his energy infrastructure, and that has been the use of missiles and drones. The one thing that Ukraine needs, though, is long-range missiles so that it can target the whole of Russia's energy infrastructure, not just that which is quite close to the Ukrainian border. And that's why things like the cruise missiles, the Tomahawk missiles, and others are so sought by the Ukrainians, because if they could get hold of those, now all of a sudden there's a much bigger target set in Russia that could come available. And although Ukraine has been building its Flamingo missiles, which have proven very effective at targeting deep inside Russia, it is those Western missiles that I think Ukraine desperately needs if it's to press home its advantage against Russia.
Okay. And Sean, all these new strikes on our energy grid, is it more about psychological terror? How do you assess that? Or because Ukraine's air defense system is getting overstretched?
Yeah, there's lots of reasons behind it. I think every year that I've been involved commentating and visiting Ukraine, in the winter, Russia steps up its attack on energy because, unlike in my country, it gets very cold with you in the winter, and therefore you need the heating systems available. By taking out the energy, it makes life miserable. But if you look back in history, wars are not won generally by imposing on the population. In my country, during the Battle of Britain or the Siege of London, there were some dreadful acts committed against civilians, but that simply hardened their resolve. And therefore, I think it's, in a way, it's a bit of a waste of missiles for Russia to target energy infrastructure if it was purely to make life miserable for Ukrainians. I think it's much more likely that Russia is starting to wake up, that Ukraine is now building a lot of its own weapons. President Zelenskyy famously said he wanted to generate 1 million drones from Ukraine's own industrial base. Most of that needs energy. Energy can be vulnerable, and that's probably why Russia is focusing its efforts against the energy infrastructure in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. I think Putin is now more mad than ever. But yeah, speaking about that, Sean, but still, you're saying that every year Russia intensifying their attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. But why can Russia see that Ukrainians can be broken? Not by bombs, not by all this darkness and cold. Do they just want more people to leave the country instead of trying to occupy it?
Yeah, it's difficult to tell, isn't it? I mean, the trouble is, if you step right back from this, President Putin probably expected to win the war in a matter of days when he advanced on Kyiv all those years ago. And it was only because of the bravery, the courage, the tenacity, and the sacrifice of Ukraine that Russia had to change its plans. Now, at the moment, Putin is still calling it a special military operation, despite the fact that everybody on the West sees this as an invasion, a war. It's been going well over 3.5 years now. Last time I came to Kyiv and walked in Maidan Square, you see the flags fluttering, a flag for lives lost. And it's incredibly moving as a military guy. Putin has struggled. He is making tactical victories on the ground, but the cost for his people, over 1 million casualties, the cost to the economy, a huge amount of the economy is now focused on the war footing, and of course that is having profound impacts on his own standing and Russia's standing in the world. So it's been a very difficult summer. We expected Ukraine might have lost even more territory. But again, Ukraine stands firm, and the West's challenge is what more we can do to help.
Yes, Sean, but I was actually reading from some military observers that Russia has slowed its pressure near Pokrovsk, but many of them also saying, observers, that they have concentrated most of their forces there, at least now. Do you think Russia could ever pull back, or is this their main goal at the moment?
Yeah, it's very difficult to work out what President Putin's objectives are. But if I was to look at it from a simple perspective, they always said that this special military operation was about the Donbas. It was about Luhansk, Donetsk. It was about Zaporizhia and Kherson, as well as Crimea. The key towns are towns like Pokrovsk, and then there are the 3 main towns just to the northwest of there. It seems like that is what the focus for Russia is. The trouble is, taking towns is incredibly costly and it takes a lot of time. It's taken well over a year for Russia to make advances into Pokrovsk. I don't know what the situation is on the ground, but it's evident that Russia is still making progress. If it does make progress in that particular area, it's going to make life very difficult in Myronrad, I think it is, just to the northeast. And then, of course, there's the Kostiantynivka and the other towns to the north. But many Western observers believe that it will take years for President Putin to take those. And I think the appetite of the West to try to step up support for Ukraine will need to actually think long and hard to stop this becoming another 3 years of war.
Yes, but how could the situation in Pokrovsk, change the overall course of the war and possibly all this negotiation process?
Well, if you're looking at tactically, Pokrovsk is on a rail hub and it's on a road hub, so it makes life more difficult for for some of the other settlements around it. And therefore, if I was an army commander, it's a very key target. But the challenge is it's a tactical game. It's not breaking through, which is what Russia would have expected to do. Let's face it, Russia is a much bigger country. It has far more resources available. It's got its country on a war footing. It's got many more people to commit to the fight, and yet still it is only making very, very slow progress. But the fact is, it is making progress. And I think what's happening in the West at the moment is this stark realization that despite the fact there's a lot of support gone to Ukraine, whether it's weapons, whether it's tanks, whether it's fighter jets, whether it's money, but it's not enough. And despite all that support, Ukraine is still slowly losing. And the challenge, I think, for the West is there are other things that the West could do, not least of which longer range missiles, also establishing no-fly zones, and also putting pressure on both economically, but also militarily on to President Putin. All of those things would increase the pressure on Putin. It might not stop the war, but my goodness, would it make life a lot more difficult for Putin to continue it.
Oh, Sean, you're definitely helping people to stay realistic. Your, answers like a cold shower, to be honest. Okay, but I was reading a few weeks ago that several military analysts suggested that Putin was losing control over the war and might look for a temporary truce. Have you seen any signs of that inside Kremlin?
No, I think, there's been a couple of things recently, like Lavrov has fallen out of favor, or apparently fallen out of favor. One of the signs from the West, and as a student of military history, a lot of dictators, their power base isn't the people, it's the oligarchs around them. It's the people who have the money, who used to be able to enjoy the fruits of their wealth in Europe, now cannot do so. And eventually their patience runs out. But returning to your earlier theme, I take no pleasure in trying to paint the picture as I see it in Ukraine. But what I do try to do, one of the reasons I come out regularly and try to support, particularly the Ukrainian Air Force, try and save lives, improve morale and do our bit to help, is that we are brothers in arms, that it is a very difficult time for Ukraine. I think all of us feel a great deal of sympathy. There are lots of Ukrainian families who settled in the UK to try to keep away from the war, and we're trying to do our best to help it. We have a lot of problems in this country, but we are still providing a lot of money and support to Ukraine. And my efforts in this side, a tiny part, but it's all part of trying to step up support for Ukraine. If Ukraine was winning, I suspect the West would be a lot less interested in providing support.
Okay, how would you describe the moment when you would realize that Ukraine is winning? What will be, or what could be, the turning point?
For me, the best opportunity at the moment is if Tomahawk missiles were able to be provided to Ukraine, if Russia's energy infrastructure, not just that near the Ukrainian border, but deep inside Russia was targeted, that would have a huge impact on Russia's ability to fund the war. It would also provide fuel shortages for Russians. That would make life more difficult for them as well. And I think then you might see an effort for President Putin to start to sue for some form of peace. I think there remain lots of challenges, though, not least of which President Putin probably will want to pause for a few years and then come again. And therefore, how does Ukraine secure long-term security guarantees from the West? Is that NATO? That doesn't look likely with the current American administration, but are there other ways in which the West could guarantee security? And I don't mean just a signature on a bit of paper, because obviously back in 1994, that didn't work, and therefore there'll need to be something rather more substantial than the Budapest Memo of 1994.
Yeah, well, what about all those people, analysts and politicians, that were saying that Ukrainians were super naive when they were hoping that the United States will give us tomahawks? I saw that and I heard that many times.
The danger is, once we start talking about President Trump, I find it very difficult to work out what his strategy is, whether in fact there is a strategy or whether it's simply a reaction. I think the West saw that President Putin was deliberately messing the American president around, but for some reason, the American president still is trying to find a peaceful way to end the war and seems to believe that President Putin is ready for that. I don't think there's anybody else in the Western world who is, but Tomahawk missiles would have been a major blow for Russia, and that's probably why President Putin spent 2.5 hours on the phone to President Trump trying to talk him out of providing those weapons. But the harsh reality, in answering your question, traditionally Western leaders have thought strategically. At the moment, it appears that the American president is thinking more tactically. So it's quite difficult to predict what he's going to do next.
Yeah, and speaking about the American president, just last week he had a meeting with Viktor Orban. And it became clear that the Hungarian leader secured full exemption from sanctions on energy deliveries via the Turkish Stream and the Druzhba pipeline. Why does Washington keep showing this strange sympathy toward everything connected to Russia? And how does that affect Moscow's position globally?
It is fascinating, isn't it? That, but I think one thing to, first of all, is never forget that no nation operates in anything other than its own national interest. And so part of diplomacy is recognizing that America doesn't own the rest of the world. It doesn't own all of Europe, and all of Europe is allowed to think independently. So despite what America does, it has to gain consensus. Viktor Orban and Hungary has a very specific set of circumstances, energy requirements, a very special relationship with President Putin, and therefore I suspect President Trump is having to be a little bit careful about that relationship. I think one of the things that's fascinating, when I last came out to Ukraine, one of the conversations I had where people were starting to become, critical is the wrong word, but angry that the West wasn't doing more to support, angry with America not doing more to support. I think we've always got to be really careful here because America is almost the other side of the world. It's the far side of the Atlantic. It doesn't feel the heat of the Russian invasion, and it has lots of its own problems. And therefore, for every pound you spend supporting Ukraine, you can't spend a pound supporting your own people. I think the fantastic thing that President Zelenskyy has managed to do over the last few years is, despite lots of our own national interest, the world, or certainly the Western world, has aligned behind Ukraine, has provided a huge amount of weaponry, a vast amount of money, and continues to support Ukraine despite domestic difficulties at home. Do I wish we could do more? Absolutely. Do I think there's more that will come? Yes, I do. But I do think that we must never forget that America particularly, but also Europe, has done a huge amount and continues to do a huge amount to try to support Ukraine.
Okay, but in that case, Sean, do you mean that we're Ukrainians not thankful enough, or we just don't really know what the United States actually doing for us and Europe as well?
No, the danger is I'm old and grey now. So things like saying that you're not doing enough or not thankful enough, that's not true at all. I think that Ukrainians are incredibly grateful, but every now and again it is worth reminding people that we won't get progress by criticising America. We'll get progress by trying to find a way of securing more support from them. And I think that's something, it's one of the reasons I try to do interviews, one of the reasons with Ukrainian television, one of the reasons I do support for the media. As an ex-military guy, I'm a talking head for the Ministry of Defence. I get briefed regularly from the UK. I'm not allowed to use that directly, but it gives you a great background. And it may not be nice hearing about it, but it's trying to be practical, but also speak truth to power, so that our leadership back in the UK and in Europe understands that away from the gloss, away from the hype, it's very difficult for Ukraine at the moment, and therefore what more can we do? And the danger is the Western officials can't hide behind the fact they're doing a lot. They have to wake up to the fact that it's not enough. And if we continue to do what we're doing, Ukraine will continue to move backwards. And the danger is that will embolden President Putin. There are other things we can do. It does risk escalation. But in my humble opinion, we have to do that if we are to stop President Putin and also set an example to China, North Korea and Iran, who otherwise might be emboldened to also start conducting military operations away from their own shores.
Yeah, you're right. Well, it's a really fine line in that issue. You know, Sean, just a year ago, we had some international conference in Kyiv, a very huge one. It was like a Yalta European strategy that are happening in Kyiv in Ukraine. So, and there was a delegation from Scandinavian countries, from Norway, from Denmark, and they were saying that, listen, to be honest, sometimes we don't know enough. What do you need? What weapon do you need? What financial support do you need? What else do you need? So maybe that's also the case, that probably we're not always, as a Ukraine, delivering the right message. And probably thanks to you, people like you, it's, happening faster.
I think that's a really good point. And I don't think it's a criticism. I just think it's an observation. One of the things I would observe is that in my military, the Royal Air Force was formed as an independent service over 100 years ago. Why was it done like that? It was because in the West, we believed you'd get more effective use of air power if it was independent rather than being part of the army. Now, the Ukrainian military, as well as the Russian military, the Air Force isn't independent. It's just an airborne artillery arm of your army units. Now, therefore, when the West is trying to support Ukraine, they genuinely believe that the air power would be more effective if it was used the way that the West uses air power. That's why we split our Air Force out from its army units to try and make it more effective. Now, does that make it right? No, it doesn't. Ukraine has to fight the way it chooses to fight. But that does create some frustrations because at the moment, I'm being generic now, nearly all the focus, understandably, is on your front line. It's on the soldiers who are fighting on the front line. But the air power, your F-16s particularly, could potentially be a lot more effective in this fight if they were able to operate under more like Western doctrine, with Western support, Western tactics, Western strategy. And that is something that is a little bit frustrating when you sit back. Now, I know that our service chiefs are trying to support the Ukrainian service chiefs because this is not just about equipment. Equipment is flowing freely. It's how you use that equipment and how you convert equipment into battle-winning capability. And that is something where there is no right and wrong, but the West has a different approach when it comes to air power than the Ukrainians do. And that is something which I suspect is causing some challenges.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Sean, finally, if Putin really is running out of strength, how can Europe take advantage of that moment?
Well, that is a great question because if you look at it from a purely military perspective, if you corner somebody, they generally come out fighting. So the challenge is, how do you create an off-ramp to allow Putin to step away and bring the war to an end? The problem with that is, of course, that inevitably means compromises. And those compromises are not going to be very palatable. Ultimately, it'll be for Ukrainians and President Zelenskyy to decide the terms under which the war is brought to an end. But I do think pressure is mounting on President Putin. I don't think we're seeing any signs that the war will end in the coming days or weeks. But as we've discussed earlier, I think there are ways in which pressure could continue to mount on President Putin. And I suspect that's what President Trump is trying to do, to keep the options open for Putin to start talking. Because however unpalatable, at least that will start the beginning of the end and mark the potential of bringing this dreadful war to an end. And if I could add one more thing, when I was out last time, a couple of people said to me, well, if Ukraine ends up losing a lot of its territory, what will all the fighting have been for? I think I'm a much more powerful about this, that nobody in the West really expected Ukraine to last this long. Ukraine has done an amazing job. It's amazing heroic activities, courage and sacrifice. And whatever the future holds, I'm confident there will be a proud and independent Ukraine, a sovereign Ukraine, able to look after itself in the future, and will be incredibly proud that it survived this awful chapter of its history. We've got to get there, and I know it's going to be difficult compromises, but ultimately this war has to be brought to an end, and Ukraine has to be safe and secure and proud and take its place in Europe.
Oh, wow. Sean, thank you so much for such a brilliant answers that are inspiring and realistic at the same time and refreshing. And thank you for everything that you are doing to Ukraine.
I'm humbled every time I come out. I'm humbled at what you guys and girls do, and anything we can do to help. I think you deserve better. And I brought back a bottle. I was given a bottle of schnapps by some of your armed forces, which traditionally they'd expect you to open at the time and share it. And I stood in front of them. I said, I'm not going to open this, but I will return to you when the war is over, and we will share a drink when the war is over. I stand by that pledge.
Yeah, I bet it's going to be like this. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.